Hello everyone. I wanted to make this video for a while and I actually started writing out a script for it and I haven't finished, and I'll probably make a more polished version in the near future, but I wanted to talk about the rise and the fall of kind of the new atheist movement, and especially I think Daniel Dennett was one of them, but especially Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. I've always been a fan of kind of the Christian apologetic debates, and I know sometimes it's not even the most useful thing to necessarily listen to because I'm not changing my mind, but I do find it fascinating for the sole purpose of trying to understand the other argument. And I recently watched Sam Harris interview and also the Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson. I wouldn't even call it a debate, it was more of a discussion. And I wanted to talk about some of the points that I saw in there and why I think essentially the whole new atheist movement, I think, is in sharp decline, collapse, and I think people are starting to understand and see the holes in how they see the world. And first and foremost, I think a lot of that was due to what happened in 2019, 2020. You guys all know what I'm talking about. But at that point in time, I think a lot of people's eyes were open to the fact that the institutions, primarily the scientific institutions, that most people, Americans, and maybe even people worldwide, placed a great deal of hope and faith into. Right? And these institutions are supposed to be those that understand, and I really hate this term, but I'm going to use it because they use it, understand the science. And that terminology has always greatly bothered me for the fact that there is no such thing as the science. There are scientists, there is a scientific method, and every person can use the scientific method to observe or to test a hypothesis, right? You set a hypothesis, I think if humans consume this compound, that it's going to have a negative effect on their health. And then you can run what's the gold standard of the scientific method, the double-blind placebo test, right? But I think a lot of people have come to realize that, number one, you can't really test things in that sort of manner everywhere. It's not feasible. For example, this is a very simple example, but when it was found out that BPA, remember the plastic bottles made with BPA, releases a estrogen mimicking hormone, right? And right away they knew that obviously that's not a good thing for especially men, but for anyone to be consuming. But at the same time, it's like, if you knew that BPA is released, do you need to really do a scientific study to know that that's not going to have a good effect? Same thing with the consumption of microplastics. It's like, do you need a double-blind placebo test to determine whether or not microplastics in your system are a bad thing? I think most people would just say no. I mean, maybe you can do a scientific experiment to see actually what are the negative effects on a person, but you do not need scientific studies for everything. A lot of times common sense will do the trick. And so I think the quote-unquote institution of science was greatly, I would say, discredited in the sense that people began to understand that they had actually not run any sort of scientific tests on certain things before they were making these kinds of assertions. Right? So we have that whole event. So there's a loss of faith in the credibility of the institutions, the science, and these figures of authority. And people began to realize that actually these people don't know what they're talking about. And instead, they're just trying to look like they know what they're talking about and kind of retroactively figure out what is good, what is not. And I think that was a huge shift, right, in the culture. But then I also wanted to talk about Sam Harris's conceptualization of how you can come to, I think he believes that there is such a thing as objective morality, but he thinks that you can come to objective morality from facts, from just experience. And the story, I actually haven't read his book, but one of the stories in his book, right, it's opening up with this woman who was, held against her will and abused and so on and so forth, right? A terrible situation. And his kind of big proclamation is, well, if we can all agree, that that's horrible, maybe we can take steps to move away from the worst possible catastrophe for everyone to something like mutually beneficial cooperation. And I think everybody would probably agree with that statement, but here's where I think it doesn't even begin to touch on the question of, okay, how do we get objective morals, right? And then can you actually come to the same moral conclusions from just facts? And I would argue to say, no, you cannot. And I think a lot of people have been coming to the same conclusions, because I would say that the last 20 years are kind of exactly, Sam Harris's kind of ideal world is the experiment of the last 20 years. And I think a lot of us have seen where that leads, right? So if we're talking about when he spoke on morality, and maybe I need to read the book just to better understand his point of view, but when he spoke on morality, he is coming to it from the lens of, I would say, probably more of a classical utilitarian style. Now, he probably might disagree with that, but when he speaks in terms of, maybe we can, rather than, cause harm to one another, we can work in cooperation. And there are these very basic, and I would say shallow and thin proclamations of morality. I think everybody understands that cooperation is better than conflict. But herein lies the problem, right? There are several moral dilemmas. Actually, where I really heard this displayed and articulated very well was this professor at Yale, and this was recorded, I think, 10, maybe even 15 years ago. And this was a course on justice, right? And there is this, he asked them a whole bunch of, moral, philosophical questions, like the famous trolley car question, which anyone who is interested in philosophy, I'm sure, who has heard of. But then there was also this very interesting question of the morality of killing one person if it benefits multiple people, right? And the scenario was this, which was actually a true story, and for which the crew was judged. And the story goes a little something like this. I'll make it real short. There was a crew of seamen, and they were either shipwrecked or they were stuck out at sea running out of food, and with them was a cabin boy, and the cabin boy was sick and was probably going to die first out of everybody, right? So the crew agrees that rather than everybody starve or have more people starve, they will kill the cabin boy prematurely and eat him. And it's kind of a gruesome story, because I really have a strong distaste for cannibalism itself. So anyway, the long story short is this crew was tried, and this professor at Yale poses this question: was the crew justified in killing the cabin boy if it was going to save more lives, right? And if you have a utilitarian point of view for morality, you would say, yes, it does. And I think anybody who can start to play out the implications of that sort of utilitarian morality quickly sees how this can lead to a society that very many people would not want to live in, right? Another scenario is that, let's say you walk into the ER, and unbeknownst to you, there's, you know, 2 other people in there. One is in need of a kidney, one is in need of heart, right? And so the doctor, in his wisdom, decides that, you know, it's better that these 2 live than this one survives, right? So they put you to sleep. Maybe you have I don't know what you have. You need to get stitches or something bad. They put you to sleep, take your organs and give them to these 2 other people without your consent, right? And this is kind of the utilitarian mindset that just does not work when practiced on a mass scale, right? There are these moral dilemmas, and some of them are impractical, but we can see that the utilitarian philosophy for morality very quickly devolves into something that is not necessarily foreseen or intended by the people. And I think Sam Harris's morality is much the same, where after listening to, it was probably far too long of an interview, but after listening to this interview with Sam Harris, I walked away thinking like, is this really how maybe I missed something? Is this really how he thinks that we can go from, you know, facts to a morality, you know, basing off the rational assessment of what is good for me and for you, right? That's kind of the basis of morality. And he draws very, I would say, childlike examples. And I'm not trying to be mean, because I don't think I'm smarter than Sam Harris. He's probably a whole lot smarter than I am. But I think when it comes to his moral reasoning, his examples appear to be far weaker than the other points. And I'd like to even bring into the example, this was funny because he was having a conversation with Alex O'Connor, who is a well-known atheist. But the thing I really enjoy with Alex is he is able to entertain the idea of a theist, and he is also able to push back on Sam Harris quite a bit, right? And so, now I don't remember if it was this conversation or a different one, but at one point Alex draws this scenario, or he kind of poses the question of, can a person create their own values, right? And someone says, well, yeah, we can create our own values. And Alex pushes back because, again, let's draw a simple example, right? There's, let's say, a millionaire, and, you know, he wants to work in philanthropy and, you know, help his fellow human being, right? And you could argue and say, oh, well, he created that value for himself, therefore other people can create subsequent values. But still, that value is oriented towards something, right? It encapsulates certain principles, and it's not just something that is completely made up and random. Another example, and this is the example that Alex uses, but you could literally substitute this for anything. You know, maybe another person decides that it is his life's calling to figure out the number of blades of grass at in the Super Bowl stadium, right? And obviously this is a very absurd example, but we can quickly see that you cannot just simply state a thing, and for, you know, regardless of your motives for doing it or anything outside of, you know, deeper driving moral principles, you cannot simply just state an activity that you would like to do and say that this is my value, that's my value, and thus they are of equal value, because it's subjective, right? And I would argue that Sam doesn't believe that, but at the same time, I think when you get into the language and verbiage that we should do what is mutually beneficial, or he doesn't even say mutually, that is the greatest good, right? So even there, he's using language where, you know, you hate to harp on this, and I don't want to sound too much like Jordan Peterson, but what do you mean by good if you've just established that what is good consist of, right? I think you have to answer that question. And he would say, well, the promotion of pleasure, and I believe he did say that in the interview, where he was saying the maximalization. He even made a sillier comment. He said all the yums and no of the no-nos. And it's a very toddler-like view on morality, because it completely disregards the bigger questions and the moral conundrums that were, posed by, the great philosophers and the thinkers. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the new atheist movement, why it falls so flat, and I think initially there was this kind of zeal to it, right? Because it was, at least in the West, I'm Russian, so we didn't have the scandal of the Catholic Church. But I think for a lot of Western countries, Europe and America, the scandals of the Catholic Church in the early 2000s were a major blow to its credibility. So riding on that wave, I think the new atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins could say, they could point to the Catholic Church and say, well, look at, all these things that they did. Who are you as the church to dictate to us what is moral and what is not moral? You guys are hypocrites, right? And I think to that, I would say, fair enough, right? But simply because there are fallible people that become exposed in an institution such as the church, which I agree is of great scandal, and probably in some cases it's warranted that they lose their credibility, right? But the institution, let's go a little bit deeper. It's what's behind the institution, right? The true and pure kind of moral principles that are found in the church and in the Bible. That should be the driving force, right? That should be the compass by which people orient themselves. And so just because there were, multiple people with scandals, it does not discredit the organization, right? You can find scandal in pretty much any large bureaucratic organization, companies, private companies. There is low-level corruption and scandal, and sometimes high-level corruption and scandal in any large institution where there are many people present, right? And they have some certain amount of authority and power. So that being said, the morality that Sam Harris proposes is one that I think that we've actually tried. It is the liberal democracy kind of experiment, right? It's the if there is a same-sex couple and they wish to get married and they wish to adopt children, who are we to say that they can't, right? Because objective morality doesn't exist. Marriage is this institution, and so we can change it at our whim, and we can essentially, shift the morality to this more modern and progressive understanding of the world. And I think we're watching how that experiment has completely failed. The rise of woke culture did not happen overnight, nor did it happen just spontaneously. If I look back, I grew up in the 90s, in the early 2000s. If I look back, I could see the seeds being planted for that sort of mindset, right? Because in the early 2000s, there was this, I would say, a large push against institutions, which was ironic because most of the large institutions, governments and huge companies now support the Rainbow People propaganda and that sort of worldview, right? But essentially the seeds were sown in the early 2000s. And so what we experienced in terms of, and I thought we kind of hit peak woke, but I think maybe I'm wrong. I think it might ride a little bit longer than we anticipate, right? But the very hard left-leaning ideologies were born from the predecessor ideologies. And so I think if we don't recognize that, we can fall into this trap that, and I think this is a trap that a lot of people fall into. They say, if we only had rationality, if we only had facts and logic, then we could create this world that doesn't have things that are generally associated with the negative things of religion. And that, I think that was the big cultural claim. That was the cultural thesis of the liberal democracy kind of experiment. And I think we can see that our society, living in America, is completely crumbling at every level, at the economic level, at the familial level. Look at the rate of divorce, at the rate of births, which a lot of countries are also suffering with that. But on every single level and every single benchmark, aside from and this one always cracks me up too, because this is a very modern idea too, is that humans always will and have to progress. And so we, just by being a part of this society, we already are more sophisticated than our predecessors, possibly 400 or 500 years ago. And I think that is completely not true. Yet that is kind of the cultural, I would say, fabric that is woven into our psyche, is the idea of progress, and the idea that progress happens no matter what. And so right now we can witness the progress of AI systems. And this is a very narrow section of education, of kind of computer engineering, one would say, right? And I'm not discounting that we have amazing, levels of machinery, but I would make the argument that, number one, those are not the only metrics of progress. Number two, I think there is a very high emphasis purely on the technology. If we look at art within architecture, if we look at cities in the United States or towns, they're atrocious. They are not places that you want to spend time with, to walk around with, to raise a family, to do any of those things, right? Because the moral philosophy driving architecture and building developments is primarily the capitalistic moral code, which is, how much money can I make and how cheap can I make it, right? That's kind of the governing principle. That's why we see strip malls that are just giant boxes everywhere, right? There is no such thing as I shouldn't say there's no such thing, because I don't like hyperbole either, but there's no such thing as kind of the artisan anymore, right? Of course there are. There's craftsmen all over the place. But it is not lifted up in society. It's how quickly, now it's just, you're a contractor. How quickly can you get this giant building up, and how fast can you do it, right? And that is not the ethos that, old world Europe, Russia, ancient civilizations live by. They live by a completely different ethos. And one tenet of that ethos was beauty. And I think when we look out in society right now, we have kind of this perversion of beauty, right? So the sexualization of everything in society, I think it's one sort of beauty, right? They're beautiful people, but it's overemphasized, and it's done to such a degree that it becomes almost like a mockery. In my previous video, the circus world, but it's beauty lifted up, and then it's beauty that is used to manipulate, right? But when we're talking about beauty in the public sphere, in terms of civic life, our world is atrociously ugly, and I live in actually a really nice place that's, I shouldn't say my place is that nice, but I live in an area that is very nice. We're close to the ocean, and the landscape is beautiful, but the urban sprawl is hideous. It really is. Yeah, and that's not an understatement. by any means, because I have spent time in old cities, I've spent time in old European cities, and the difference is, I mean, it's night and day. And for anyone who's experienced that, they know that. Okay, so hopefully I didn't get too far off topic, because I wanted to cover also Richard Dawkins, who I find him fascinating in the sense that I don't understand why people keep asking him to do interviews and talk about the same certain subjects when he doesn't have a whole lot to say in terms of, he's not very studied in terms of theology and philosophy, and even, I would say, debate, because in the conversation with him and Jordan Peterson, it was quite interesting because Dawkins said this one thing, that he is not interested in myths. He is interested in the facts that get a person to the moon, right? And I think that's a valid thing to be interested in. But going back to this, most things in the world, or the things that you care about in your life, are not those types of facts. They are not calculations on how, I can land my car into my garage. They are lived things that neither have a scientific method that is possible to even measure them, right? Some of the most important things in life are like that. Love. Can you measure love? Can you measure the amount of love? Can you describe it in a scientific sense? I'm sure some people do try to do this, where they all link it to brain chemistry. It's your, amygdala is firing. It's like being on drugs. But again, those are not real descriptors. They're narrowly useful descriptors of something that is happening in you, right? But they are not useful every day. If I were to get you a readout of the brain chemistry of your brain the last time you were severely depressed, I don't think it would help you to make any decision. It wouldn't even help you to understand your depression. It would simply describe what is happening at the molecular and hormonal and chemical level, right, within your brain. It does not do anything else. And we can think of this same type of thing when we think about even people. Let's say, for instance, you have a friend, right? You could describe her in a number of different ways, maybe even infinite ways, if you're smart enough. But theoretically, you could describe her as the girl with the brown hair and the piercing green eyes, right? That's a descriptor. What if I read out to you her DNA sequence, right? That's the most scientifically accurate descriptor, but it tells people absolutely nothing about the person. There's zero useful information there unless you are in the field of biochemistry, or you're a doctor and you need to solve a certain problem. But the fact that you can describe a person as, fun-loving and she's spunky and this and that, those are not scientific terms. And I would argue that most of our life is not looked at through the scientific, purely rational lens. And I also think too, I want to touch on this point too before I forget, that rationality in and of itself, I think, is, number one, I think it's overrated. And number two, I don't think it is actually used as much as people claim it is, right? Even for, which I consider myself very rational, but at the same time, I know there are things that I do that are not rational at all. They are not rational. They are simply because I have maybe a base desire, or, some of those things are good, some of them are bad, but they are not rational mental processes that I go through in my head. They just simply are not. And so you cannot say that, introducing rationality will simply change the world, because number one, let's see, I want to touch on this subject and hopefully I don't forget. But number one, okay, let's imagine a world, right, where there is rationality, and rationality is the purest it is our guiding light, let's say, right? So this is my issue with placing rationality and logic and facts as the top thing above God, right? Because I would make the argument that if you live from a purely rationalistic point of view, there's no reason for you to value each human life with the same moral worth, right? Moral worth. Because if we kind of run into a segue of the first dilemmas where, let's say, for instance, we live in a hyper-rationalist society, and we deem that, once a person gets above the age of 70, statistically speaking, they are going to be more of a burden on society as a whole, and they are not statistically going to have enough family to look after them. And so for the people that fall into the age category of being retired, we're not going to assume that they're going to figure things out. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of the main issue and just euthanize all people over the age of 70 who have no family to take after them and are a burden on the government. Right? That's kind of a conclusion of a purely rationalistic society, because why should they say, no, every life is sacred? Well, you would say rationally, look, this person doesn't do anything. She just sits there and watches, Judge Judy and, soap operas or whatever it is that people do in those types of places. She is not useful to anyone. She doesn't have a family. So what benefit to her, even, they would argue this. I'm of course not of this belief, but they would argue, what use is she bringing to society at large, taxpayers and the nation? She's not. And so therefore we should get rid of the people that are deemed a burden in society. Same with, let's say, for instance, a fast food worker, right? What if we had to save a philosopher, a doctor, and an engineer? And this guy that works at this fast food place happens to have organs or whatever have you, to essentially save these people in a purely rationalistic society that does not value, I always love because people say, no, well, I still value human life as, special. But why? Why in the world would you value it as special if it is the result of an evolutionary process? It makes zero sense. Right? You don't come to the conclusion of inherent moral worth or equal moral worth among humans without faith and without religion, without the dogma. And I kind of hate that word because it has only a negative connotation, but without the tenets or what is written in the Bible, you don't come to that worldview. Right? You may hold that worldview. This is, I think, where a lot of people get in trouble, is they hold that worldview, but they cannot articulate why they have that worldview. Right? That's a common ihe is my phone died, so hopefully I'll be able to catch my train of thought. This is already the next day, but what I was talking about is people oftentimes hold views, and when pressed on those views, they don't have an adequate description of how they come about getting them. I recently also saw a debate which this man posits the idea of ethics as something that people gain as the result of wanting to maintain life and maintain their life and maintain flourishing. And I think it's when we start to get into the subject of ethics and human flourishing, it's very difficult for me to take those seriously, because the idea of flourishing can be interpreted so very differently, right? And so you would still have this subjective, I would call it, lens through which people view flourishing. For some people, flourishing means to live in a 5-bedroom house on the beach. For other people, the idea of human flourishing for their family is something totally different, and it might be expressed moreover in the ethics and values of their family. It might be expressed in the way that their family communicates with each other, the relationships within that family. And so just to say human flourishing, I think, is a very vague and thin way to veil ethics. And so I'll conclude this video with why I think that the new atheist movement has utterly collapsed, is because there is nothing behind it. When you try to stand on firm ground, it's kind of like you're left with just the platitude of, well, just be a good person, and what does that look like? Well, eliminate pain and increase pleasure. And maybe some people obviously are not saying that from a purely hedonistic point of view, but still there's not really anything to stand on. There's not a firm foundation. There's not even an aligned set of ethics that all new atheists can agree on. Rather, it becomes just my opinion versus your opinion. And that is why I think in today's age, more people are looking for something deep, something ancient, something old, and something that has stood the test of time in terms of offering a set of values by which one can live their life. For me, that's orthodoxy, and I know a lot of people have converted to the Catholic Church. I know Protestantism in America is still, I think it's Catholicism and Protestantism. I think Protestants probably have more members in America than they do anywhere else. But for me, predominantly as a Russian, Orthodoxy is the main religion of Russia, and Orthodoxy has far more members in Russia than any other denomination. So even though it is the minority here, it is by no means the minority in every country. And I think there is a big draw from young men to find a firm moral ground to stand on, something that, because something that isn't subjective. And I think the new atheist movement, we can also see this too with the way that I think the TDS, the Trump derangement syndrome, broke Sam Harris's brain a little bit, because just the amount of hate that he has toward Trump is so evident in the interviews that he gives, that it's funny because he's known as, the rational thinker, but I would say it's completely irrational the way that his dislike for him. And I think it's the liberal intellectuals' disdain for this figure, right? And I think a lot of people have caught on to that, and that is why the new atheist movement is no longer.